Okay. Well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming. And it's great to be here back in KZN after some time. So yesterday, Ali Kaka from the IUCN say, people were probably wondering what a Kenyan was doing in South Africa, teaching how to do conservation. Probably a lot of people here are wondering what someone from the University of Helsinki is doing here. And probably worse if you think that an Italian talking about economics in conservation planning, considering the current economic crisis. So as you can see, the title. Before starting, actually, I would like to give you like a broad introduction and put my presentation into context of the broader conservation planning literature. So we need to protect very important areas for biodiversity, but the problem is that most of these areas fall within areas which are highly human, with high human population density, and actually with also very high poverty levels. So we need to consider such needs into our work, because otherwise we have failed to never implement the conservation planning assessments that we produce. So some of the socio-economic and political constraints are way more important than some of the fancy modeling work that we do on ecosystem functioning and species distribution modeling and looking at conservation priority. So my work is actually looking at how to trade off between what conservation priorities, which is high conservation value and areas which are under threat, and also being able to look at actually selecting areas where either people are willing to participate in activities, we've been hearing about conservation stewardship agreements, or where, as we will see today, conservation can pay the bill for itself. So actually, Michael, your presentation was very appropriate. It was actually giving a background to my work also, which is more spatially explicit. So normally when I present at the international conference, I would actually speak about rhinos. I mean, we had like a fantastic session this morning, and people always like go, oh, when I say that there were less than 15 to 20 in 1895, and we all found in the current Pelosi Park, and now we got more than 20,000 in the wild, okay? But here I've got experts, so I can't actually sell my presentation for that. So we are actually focusing on an area which is internationally recognized for its importance, and there needs to be work being carried out, which is already being carried out in a fantastic way here on the ground by Zembello and other stakeholders. But my work is actually slightly different, looking at some other opportunities. But also, I try to actually account for some of the needs for human and economic development within the province. So how do you actually do that in a conservation plan? How do you actually prioritize important areas for protected area expansion, while also considering some of the needs of very poor people in a province where there are very high inequality levels, etc., etc. And the other presentation that was on ecosystem services before was talking about mining. It's a daunting threat. So actually, can we prioritize and actually try and look at allow mining in areas which are not very important for biodiversity? So today I'll be focusing on a conservation planning framework which is called Zonation, which has been developed by Atemo Ilanen in Finland, my boss. And it's a framework which can account for a number of biodiversity features. So it's basically species distribution models, habitat models, ecosystem services models. But in one of the last actual features, we can also account for a number of opportunity costs, which are actually basically the economic return which is generated by competing activities from conservation. And in our case, we can also account for some of the economic benefits, okay? So we can actually see whether there are win-win strategies for biodiversity conservation from the conservation sector itself. And so just to actually show you the way it works, because very often people are sort of like scared of these prioritization frameworks, thinking that it's very difficult to do. And actually, it's fairly straightforward to click the button on a conservation planning software. I think every one of us can do it. You don't have to be a genius to do that, but it takes a while to actually put together all the information which is required, and based also on some of the needs which you find on the ground. So basically what you do, you acquire a lot of information, which is basically on presence location for species, or some of the habitat maps which have been already generated. You then actually do a lot of work within a GIS platform to sort of put all the layers with the same resolution. You also ask the experts, which is quite important, because very often we don't have like the expertise to actually go down and know how the butterflies, what's the distance that the butterfly disperse, for instance. So we actually need to engage with experts, and that's actually quite important. And then at a later stage, you can actually work on setting targets for conservation. This framework also uses weights. So basically, if you have like species and you want to use the IUCN ranking for the species, you can actually use within the prioritization framework. And one of the specific features is that because it's been created within the meta-population group led by Ilka Hansi, basically you can actually set up a connectivity value for each species that you include into your prioritization. So basically the output is also looking at creating populations of species which can be connected. We know it's highly difficult because most of the environments you're working in are highly fragmented, but actually you can actually do this in a framework. And then you get like areas of high conservation value, which are used, actually are those that we should be focusing on for protected area expansion. And also we get areas of low conservation value where actually development can occur. So a number of conservation features being included here. Again, they've been selected because there were other endemic or threatened. I see Dr. Faman at the back, so there's also a black rhino involved in the prioritization. And now, normally when I show this slide, I normally look at the faces of people because we go like, okay, what is scary? It shouldn't actually be too scary. I mean, it's just an equation that explains how I actually calculated economic return for each competing land use to conservation. So basically what we did, we looked at the benefits which you can generate from each land use, which you then subtract the total production cost if you're actually looking at agricultural land use or commercial forestry or even mining. And then in order to be compared, all these land uses, they need to be discounted to a present day value in order to be compared. What does it mean? So if you're investing in ecotourism, you'll start making money, I don't know, after 10, 15 years, you made investment. For if you're producing potatoes, you actually crop them right away, and actually you get like return within 1 year. So yeah, you definitely need to actually use this sort of equation to be able to compare those alternative land uses. And this is actually just explaining that all the models are spatially explicit, so we can actually come up with a total economic value for that particular parcel of land. So just to explain you some of the outputs here, so basically as you can see, the opportunity costs vary across the landscape. And actually if you look at something like agriculture being with water being used, you can see how the landscape can actually turn into profitable all over. So it's like an increased risk and threat for conservation. And this is eucalyptus. You can see actually how the opportunity cost, the suitability of the habitat of that land use varies across the landscape. But then this is actually something which is unique for this environment, and actually a lot of people, when you give presentation, they say, oh, but that's like, really like you need from South Africa. You can really make money out of conservation, okay? Michael was actually pointing that out earlier. And it's actually a major driver for protected area expansion. So for instance, in this work, we included a map, which can be considered a map for ecosystem services for sustainable resource use. So we looked at the potential of trophy hunting and live sales on the landscape to generate revenue. And then we also looked at the potential for ecotourism. Now I'm going to get more into detail for ecotourism, because if I were to explain into detail how I created each map, it would probably take us like 3 sessions, so I don't want actually to bother you. But there's a paper which is forthcoming paper in conservation biology, which will actually explain all of this more into detail. So we use a tier 1 approach, which has been developed by the Natural Capital Project in the US. And basically, what you do is you actually need to evaluate the attributes of ecotourism. Okay, in this case, we focused on charismatic megafauna. And some of you have received my paper. I hope at least some of you in the room I know did. But what I did, I interviewed like more than 700 tourists over two seasons to actually look at which are the favorite species in KZN, interviewing in HIP and East Mandaliso. And we came out with some interesting results. I'll feel free to actually get hold of me later on. I can give you a copy of the paper. And then once you go like the favorite species for the tourists, you go and map species distribution. And then you overlay the different species distributions and you create a biodiversity supply map. But then that's not enough, because you want to know which areas are more accessible for tourists, okay? Because they're lazy, they don't want actually to travel very long distances, okay? It's not like hunters, which are prepared to actually go in very remote areas. So you actually overlay another accessibility map, and then on top of that you put like real-world economic data. So economic profit, which is generated for ecotourism from number of tourists visiting, the price they're paying per night, and then you actually subtract again the management cost for some of these protected areas, and you come up with some of these values. And of course you also add some of the threats which are remaining, because you want to actually see where there's immediate threat from some other threats. And here are just some of the results. How am I doing for time?
You still have 9 minutes.
Okay, really done. So just to show you, so first of all we did a spatial prioritization for each land use category separately. Okay, we wanted to see, without constraints, where we should have invested our money if we were either a farmer, a commercial forester, a miner, or someone working for Isandel. Okay, where do we have to put our money? And so, for biodiversity, this is the output of a prioritization based on the 600 odd biodiversity features which we included. And you can see how some of the priorities actually are spread across the province. This is for conservation businesses, so it's ecotourism and sustainable resource use. And you can see, obviously, a lot of you are working up in Zululand, you know, for charismatic species, that's like the main area. We all know that. But actually it's also interesting, like this area around Minin Game Reserve, which had some of the charismatic species before, let's say elephants, and they've been removed. So there's a lot of potential also in that area for conservation businesses. But also if you look at the other 3 land use categories, so mining, forestry, and agriculture, you can see, like in the Drakensberg, of course, there's like high potential for commercial forestry. Obviously, there's high potential in the East Mandaliso. We still see the scars in that environment of commercial forestry, and also it was also suitable for sand mining. Okay, so you can see actually how these prioritization can show you where the threat is coming from. Okay, because if you were to invest your money, you would go actually for the areas which provide the highest economic return. And so we found, I don't have the numbers here, but we found that if we were just to look at these single prioritization, there was still like a huge amount of conflict, okay? Which basically says that there is like a lot of habitat transformation likely to happen in the future. And actually yesterday we had a presentation on looking at the rates of transformation from 1994 till today, and see how big of a threat that is. But then actually when we look at including in the same analysis all of these land uses together, okay, so we're actually trading off, we're trying to trade off. And we start with the economic benefits first, okay, so here there's no biodiversity features included, it's just a prioritization made on spatial economic return models, although we can actually understand how much these areas are protecting in terms of biodiversity. You can see, for instance, how the East Mandaliso would eventually provide lower economic return compared to alternative land uses. And you see why actually they went and invest there. I'm not saying that we should be degazetting Eastern Mangalism, don't take me wrong here. But in pure economic terms, you can see actually why they are taking some decisions like to invest in commercial forestry in those areas. And I think it's actually important that we are aware of that. So here we are doing, on the other hand, a prioritization which also includes, and actually, sorry, I forgot the most important aspect, which are the numbers. So a lot of, we've been actually looking at a lot of numbers here today, and actually they can have the relevance that you want to put on top of that. We can actually say that economic evaluation is not only the only strategy to look at our environment, we actually also have to look at human well-being, etc., etc. But definitely, there's a potential for a win-win strategy here for both conservation and development, okay? And also, so these are the two prioritizations based on all land uses, including biodiversity, in which you can see that basically the areas, well, first of all, that the Zambelo protected area network is very good in protecting biodiversity already. Of course, some of you are aware that on that map, actually, we got like some of the private game reserves and community reserves missing. For instance, in this area, you can clearly see where some of those reserves happen to be. So actually, we are already meeting some of the most important goals. But like, look at this belt here with this like very high threat of transformation because of, for instance, urban development. So there is definitely more need for protection there. Okay, conclusion. I think I'm getting a little bit with time. So I really drew some conclusions, but I would like to actually just highlight some important aspects here. So this kind of framework can be used for highlighting both areas which are in need of protection, and at the same time areas where you can achieve sustainable development, which is very important in policy both at a local, continental and global level. They can be used to promote implementation, and particularly I think such framework would be useful for highlighting areas where conservation stewardship agreements should be made, okay? And then, because they got a dollar sign on them, they can actually, be used to inform decision makers or policy makers more easily, because that's actually language that they understand, rather than actually some strange equation on ecosystem functioning, etc., etc. And I can't but stress always like the need of interdisciplinary research. South Africa is big on this. I'm not actually the first one to point this out. Richard Carling and Andrew Knight have been doing a lot of work on this side. But it's really important actually that we do more. And just a bit of self-promotion at the end. So if you want to download the software or play around with the software, there's actually a manual here that I believe there's Zambelo Biodiversity Unit. I think I'll leave it with Debbie. But Pete and Boyd have got like personal copies as well. And there's also some other software that we are developing and can be used for instance, offsetting the risk of mining or looking at different management strategies for species in need. And yeah, some acknowledgments, and thank you very much for listening.
Very interesting concepts. We should abandon Ismangaliso. There's no need for UDP. Are there any questions? I've got time for one. Why are we leaving now? Is it hot now? Some water. There's one day. Yeah.
Yes. How you calculated that index over time? It really seems to me that your model is more static over time. There are no changes in conclusion. But there's so many things which are changing over time. Yeah, no changes.
Yeah.
Are there any plans to improve that?
Yes. Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, it's another bit of work, but this was part of my PhD, and as you can imagine, there's so many things already that you can be missing. There are some other questions that we are interested in answering. For instance, think about the impact of climate change on the different land uses as well, okay? And how it's actually maybe shifting the suitability of habitat according to, you know, different rainfall or increased high temperatures. So we could actually look at a little bit more on to a dynamic system in the future. But it was really like a lot of work to generate this model. As you can imagine.
Thanks a lot. That's all we have time for. Thanks a lot, Enrico. Next up is Ms. Pili Lembata from the University of Cape Town to talk about enhancing the benefits to small-scale fisheries along the east coast of South Africa.